Three-dimensional real-time graphics. That is something that we are all used to today. Practically every video game, AAA titles or otherwise, use polygonal-based 3D graphics. And of course, practically all of us have some sort of dedicated GPU in our consoles or computers that are capable of puking out thousands upon thousands of fancy shaded and textured polygons per second. But what about 3D in the dark ages of gaming, in the early 80s? Well, you pretty much had to cheat using various techniques to create a 3D-like world. One such technique was called isometric projection. And the very first game that used this was Data East arcade game Treasure Island. It was released in Japan in September 81 and internationally in June 82. It is a pretty obscure scrolling treasure hunt game that most people seem to have forgotten about. But the first internationally released isometric game was Sega's Saxon, released in April 82. This is by many considered to be the first isometric video game. The game was a major hit in North America and among the top 6 highest grossing arcade games of 82 in the US. The game's name comes from the word axonometric, which defines the group of projections that includes isometric projection, if I have understood it correctly. Naturally, isometric graphics quickly spread to the home computers, and in '83 Sandy White's 3D Ant-Attack was released for the ZX Spectrum. It was one of the first, if not the first, isometric game for a home system. The game was a huge success and everyone was blown away by its visuals. After that, the isometric ball really got rolling and everyone and their grannies started creating isometric games for the 8-bit home computers. With such classics as Fairlight, Night Law, Alienate, The Great Escape, The Last Ninja series and many more. By the time when the 16-bit systems rolled in, the isometric craze had calmed down somewhat. But let's have a look at 10 different isometric games on the ST.
Number 1.
First one up is Airball, and this is the first isometric game I came across on my ST, but it's not the first one ever published. That honor probably befalls Magnetic Tank or Marble Madness, which were released already in '86. Airball has a pretty neat idea for its gameplay. You've been turned into an air-filled ball by an evil wizard, and since this wizard really is a complete brick basket, he also made sure that you are slowly leaking air, and he has thrown you into a maze consisting of 150 rooms filled with sharp and pointy objects. You need to navigate your way through this maze and find the spellbook and the ingredients for a spell that turns you back into human form. And as with many isometric games of the day, you also need to solve puzzles where you stack items on top of each other to reach new areas. There's also items that will help your progress in the game. You will also find pumps scattered throughout the maze where you can refill your air, but don't overdo it. These also cleverly act as checkpoints. Every time you die, you are sent back to the last one used. The game really looks gorgeous for its time, with lots of detailed sprites and good use of color, and I really wanted to like it. Unfortunately, it's not without problems. As with many isometric games of the time, it's often hard to judge a position in relation to the obstacles. The controls are also super sensitive, and sometimes it's infuriatingly difficult to line yourself up correctly. If you're 1 pixel off, it's back to the last checkpoint. Fuck. 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 That combined with only 4 lives make the game pretty damn frustrating. At least for me and my lack of patience. They also released Airball Construction Kit, which allowed you to create your own standalone levels. Pity I didn't have this one back in the day. Would probably have had more fun with the editor than the actual game. The beautiful graphics were created by the very talented Pete Lyon, and I think this was one of the first ST games he worked on. He has created graphics for many ST classics. The last game he was involved with, as far as I can tell, was Worms United for PC in 2012. Today he seems to be working as a freelancing artist.
Number 2.
Crystal Castles can be described as an isometric version of Pac-Man, where Pac-Man has been replaced by a bear called Bentley, and the Ghost by a varied selection of hostiles that all have Bentley on top of their menu. One would imagine that a bear would be pretty high up on the food chain, but sadly not Bentley. This is a conversion of the Atari arcade game released in '83, and it's a pretty solid conversion. The SD version is a bit slower, lacks a trackball of course, and is less difficult. It's also running at a higher video resolution, 320 by 200 pixels, compared to the arcade version's 256 x 232, which means that the SD version actually looks better. The first time I saw this on my ST, I found the visuals to be a bit uninspiring, but I gave it a chance and ended up enjoying it. On each stage you need to collect gems, while being pestered by 7 different enemy types, all with their own MO. Interestingly, some of the enemies will happily steal gems if they pass over them, so you need to be quick to maximize your score. Bentley can also jump over enemies, which can be a bit tricky, but very useful. There's also a hat to pick up that you pull over your eyes, preventing you from seeing the enemies and thus making you invincible for a short time, in true ostrich myth style. There's a lot of neat little touches in the game that makes it thoroughly enjoyable. The different enemies forces you to change your playstyle accordingly and making the game more fun. The only real problem is the controls. Bentley will quickly accelerate to breakneck speed and slam into enemies and miss a turn by miles. The game will also automatically realign you if you get stuck on a corner, often sending you hurling down the wrong path and into the open embrace of an enemy. Not much is known about the people behind this conversion, only that it was developed by the UK company Andromeda Software. They often used East Bloc developers, and I think that in this case this game was developed by an Hungarian company. On a final note, this game will also run in ST high-res monochrome mode, which really wasn't that super common for games.
Number 3.
It's time to meet the isometric king on the ST, Cadaver by Bitmap Brothers. In this arcade adventure you take control of Caradoc the Dwarf in his quest to rob Castle Wolf Blind. The adventure puzzle aspect of the game is surprisingly in-depth and involves many different objects to pick up and manipulate, some of which are completely useless. Gameplay is fun, if a bit tricky at times, but it's a pure pleasure to explore the stunning looking levels of Castle Wolf, of which there are 5. The controls are a bit quirky though and take some getting used to. Also, some of the puzzles and item interactions aren't entirely intuitive. But regardless, the star of the show is definitely the visuals. A lot of effort and love has been put into the isometric tileset. It's also impressive to see how the game engine allows for so much visual variation, keeping up interest as you explore the unique looking rooms. And this also makes navigating around the rather large levels very easy. There is an almost insane level of detail in the graphics, and they are made even more impressive by the fact that the artists are using a maximum of 16 colors on screen at once. Thanks to all of this, the game received favourable reviews in the press at the time, but still wasn't a commercial success unfortunately. There was also an expansion disc released in '91 called Cadaver the Payoff. It required the original game and you simply replace the second disc of the original release with the expansion disc. It's pretty much more of the same, with 4 new levels, spells and items. The 2 artists behind the graphics are Daniel Malone and Robin Chapman. Malone focused on the creatures and the architecture in the game, and he is a veteran artist in the gaming industry and began his career in the mid-80s on the 8-bit home computer systems. He still seems to be working as an artist today, but not sure if he's still in the gaming industry. Chapman designed the title and object graphics. He also seems to have started his career in the mid-80s creating graphics for the home computer systems. The most recent game he worked on seems to have been Beast Wars Transformers on PlayStation 1 and PC. After that he seems to have left the gaming industry.
Number 4.
Next one up is Treasure Trap, and this one has its root in the classic isometric games on the 8-bit systems, like Night Lore and Head Over Heels. You are a deep-sea diver driven by avarice to search for gold in the sunken ship the Esmeralda. And needless to say, this ship is teeming with hostile marine life forms. And you also need to make sure to refill your air supply with the air tanks that lie scattered throughout the ship. The puzzles in the game aren't very taxing and usually consist of you pushing various objects around to allow you to jump on them and get to out-of-reach places. So very much like the old 8-bit isometric games. There's also a pretty interesting save-to-disk mechanic in the game. For every 50 bars of gold you collect, you are allowed to save your game. The visuals of the game is definitely its strong point, and the underwater world is colorful and beautifully detailed, and quite fun to explore. It's also quite refreshing to play in an underwater environment. But the locations do get a bit repetitive and gameplay feels a bit lacking at times. The game also slows down quite significantly when there's lots of enemies on screen. Enemy movement patterns are also a little bit too random, which leads to some pretty cheap deaths. The beautiful graphics for all versions of the game was created by Paul McLaughlin. Sadly, he seems to only have worked on one other ST game, and that was Populous 2. After quitting Emerald Software in '89, he started working as head of art at Bullfrog Productions, and has since been involved in practically all of the games produced by Bullfrog and Lionhead Studios. In 2012, he started working as director of arts at 22 Cans, a company founded by Peter Molyneux. He still seems to hold this position to this day.
Number 5.
Here's another arcade conversion, Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters, which is an Atari arcade game released in '89, designed by Mark Stephen Pierce. It's a multi-directional shooter with some lovely graphics, firmly anchored in the style of 50s campy B-movies. Apparently only 371 dedicated arcade units were manufactured in the US of this game, so it might not have been a huge success in the arcades, but it's certainly fun to play. In the game you run around a research facility shooting various robots and trying to save human slaves, a bit like an isometric Robotron really, and there's also bonus stages and boss fights. The SD conversion is fairly faithful to the original and also decently fun to play. But it's not without its problems. The flip scrolling is really annoying and makes it hard dodging the robots and their projectiles. They will also happily fire projectiles from off screen, making for some rather cheap moments. Enemies also have an annoying tendency to appear out of nowhere and surround you, especially when the screen flip scrolls. And the at times dodgy hit detection doesn't really improve things either. The visuals are really nice though, even if they maybe feel a bit small and thus lack detail. The sprite size probably had to be kept down to not murder the frame rate completely. But there is still some slowdown when there's many robots on screen, but it's fairly manageable. The graphics were created by Neil Adamson. He started his career in game development in '88, creating the graphics for the Spectrum version of Treasure Island Dizzy. He has since worked for quite a few different companies. As of 2020, he was still active in the industry, working for Distinctive Developments Limited, creating graphics for their mobile platform games.
Number 6.
Head Over Heels is a game that was originally released on the ZX Spectrum. It was coded by John Rittman and with some lovely graphics by Bernie Drummond. It was published by Ocean in '87 and is by many considered a masterpiece even to this day. And the game has seen numerous conversions over the years. In the game you can switch between two different characters, Head or Heels, and they each have their own abilities. At the beginning of the game they are separated from each other and you need to solve various classic isometric puzzles to bring them together. Once they are reunited, you can put Head on top of Heels and join them up. An absolutely brilliant design idea. And from then on you can choose between controlling them as one or separate them and use their individual abilities. Gameplay is challenging and fun, with some minor complaints, like how enemy movement patterns can be a bit too random at times. But otherwise the SD version feels very much like the Spectrum version, just a bit smoother and faster. The conversion to the ST was handled by Colin Porch, and apparently he did this on his own spare time, and when the game was finished he contacted Ocean and they instantly bought it, without any prior knowledge of it existing. I believe the graphics were just ported straight from the Spectrum and hand-colored by Colin. They still look great, but I feel that color could have been used better, and I actually think I prefer Drummond's original monochrome Spectrum graphics. Here's probably the most recognized sprite from the game, the Prince Charles Dalek. The face was originally supposed to be based on a character called Plug from the British comic strip Bash Street Kids, but Rittman felt he looked as much like Prince Charles and also felt that acknowledging this might benefit the marketing of the game. Sadly, Drummond only worked on a handful of games, mostly together with Rittman. He left the gaming industry in the late 90s and started studying, And in 2000 he created and conducted a field study of atmospheric phenomena, and after finishing that he got into film and video production. Sadly, he unexpectedly passed away in November 2021.
Number 7.
Together with Cadaver, Voodoo Nightmare is definitely one of the best looking isometric games on the ST, at least in my humble opinion. You find yourself stuck in a jungle with a voodoo mask permanently attached to your face. To get rid of it, you must find a voodoo doll and 8 magical pins that you can stick into it to defeat the evil medicine man. The pins are spread out in 5 different temples. In the temples you need to collect gems to please the god of the temple, to get a pin and to be allowed to leave. The jungle is definitely the most fun part of the game. It looks gorgeous and is quite fun to explore thanks to this, at least initially. You will also find various simple puzzles to solve here, and there's also stores where you can buy stuff to help you on your way. The temples though are quite repetitive and are mostly about solving very similar teleport-based puzzles and navigating around mazes where it's often really hard to see where you can go or not. You're also constantly assaulted by various nasties, and while they look very nice, you do get a bit tired of having to deal with them constantly. All in all, gameplay feels somewhat lackluster and repetitive. Even with all that is going on, there's really not enough variation to keep things that interesting. The jungle graphics definitely look the best, with superb use of color and with lots of attention to detail. Temples looks nice too, but there is less variation and they just seem to change tile sets between them while maintaining the same basic design. But there is a lot of love put into all the visuals, and that is what keeps up the interest, at least initially. Graphics were created by Lorne Campbell and Lyndon Brooke. Campbell also created some really awesome black and white illustrations for the manual, making it one of the coolest looking 16-bit manuals I have ever seen. Campbell doesn't seem to have been involved in that many games, and it looks like he left the gaming industry in 2004 after working on Catwoman by Argonaut Games. Brooks seems to still be working in the gaming industry today and have been involved in quite a few games on many different systems. He is currently working as a senior technical artist at Team 17 in Manchester.
Number 8.
The next game is a true classic and considered to be the first God game. And one of the designers was none other than Pete Promise Too Much Molyneux. And we are of course talking about Populous, the game where you take on the role of a god and get to torment lots and lots of puny humans. Still remember seeing an article in Ace about the game in early '89 and being completely blown away by the visuals. I couldn't believe what I was seeing was actual SD graphics. Gameplay may seem a bit complicated at first, but it's actually pretty straightforward. As a god, you need to help your followers by leveling the isometric landscape so they can build settlements, thrive and reproduce faster than your opponent's followers. And of course, being a god, you have divine intervention abilities, which allows you to torment your opponent's followers using earthquakes, floods, volcanoes, swamps and such. The isometric graphics might not be the best looking ones on the ST, but for their time they were very impressive, and the way you could raise and lower the landscape was absolutely fascinating. But the landscapes did get a bit repetitive and there weren't that many different visual elements in the game. But they did make up for that somewhat by having 4 different landscape types: grassy, desert, volcanic and ice. There was also an expansion disc called The Promised Lands, released in '90. It gave you 5 additional landscape types: Silly Land, Wild West, Blockland, Revolution and the Bit Plains. And apparently the developers used Lego to help visualize the game as they were developing it. It's also interesting to note that the game was actually developed in C instead of assembler, which could explain why it's a bit sluggish at times. The graphics were designed by 4 different artists: Glenn Corpse, Andy Jones, Sean Cooper and Dan Wheeler. Interestingly, only 16 different pieces of graphics were used to make up the ground. Very clever stuff!
Number 9.
There is another game that started its life on the ZX Spectrum. Denton Designs Where Time Stood Still was a big hit on the Speccy and is pretty much considered a classic. The game's monochrome graphics works very well and gives it a feel of a 50s adventure movie. In the game, 4 people have survived a plane crash in an area filled with dinosaurs and cannibalistic natives. Your task is to take control of one of the characters and lead the rest to safety. And you can switch between them whenever you want to. And on your way you will find various items to help you out. All the characters have their own personalities and will react to what is going on around them. Your ultimate goal is to bring all of them to safety, but you may finish the game with only one survivor. So if you're a bit of a cynic, you can just consider the other 3 as extra lives. The graphics are grayscale, which again makes you feel like you're playing an old 50s movie. It's quite fun to explore the game, but the isometric visuals can sometimes be quite confusing. Another source of frustration is that these 3 characters move around by themselves and they will happily surround you whenever you're trying to pick up items, making this quite challenging at times. Their pathfinding is also absolutely atrocious at times, with computer-controlled characters absolutely refusing to follow you or just plain getting stuck on pretty insignificant obstacles. This aspect hasn't aged at all well and is utterly infuriating. The beautiful visuals were created by Steve Kane. He started his career already in '83 working for Imagine in Liverpool, and when they went bust in '84, he formed Denton Designs together with some other former Imagine employees. He has also been working for Microprose, Rage and Acclaim. In 2004 he was diagnosed with lung cancer and he left the gaming industry in 2005. He sadly passed away in July 2006 at a way too young age.
Number 10.
How about an isometric puzzle game? Because that is what Psygnosis Nevermind is, and it's pretty novel and clever. It initially seems rather confusing and complicated, but all you really need to do is to move around an isometric landscape and collect pieces of a picture puzzle that you then need to assemble. You also have a time limit to contend with and a bunch of super pesky enemies that will happily scramble your puzzle pieces and get in your way. The game is pretty much all about memory and speed, and of course getting used to the tank controls. Interesting trivia, only the first half a dozen or so maps were created manually. The rest were automatically created at night via a random map generator, which would generate hundreds of maps each night, and apparently 99% of them were culled after testing, and this was done of course due to a tight deadline. The graphics are nice, if a bit monotonous. I suspect a lot of disk space is taken up by the puzzle pictures, though they probably had limited space for the other visuals. It's also sometimes a bit hard making out the pictures you need to assemble. Apparently the developers had to change some of the graphics to allow for US distribution. Psygnosis US wasn't too excited about a pentagram and some black candles being depicted in the game. So the pentagram had to go and the black candles were painted white and voila! Politically correct graphics. The visuals were made by veteran artist Neil Thompson. He started his career at Icon Design Limited in '87, where he worked on Pool and Return of the Mutant Camels. He has since remained in the gaming industry and worked for BioWare among quite a few other developers. And with that we have reached the end of the video. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider supporting me on Patreon or Ko-fi to help me make more of these videos.